Lecture 3, Sumer, Akkad, and Early Mesopotamian Warfare.
In the last lecture, we saw how the issue of warfare's origins proved to be a methodological and evidentiary quagmire where certainty proves elusive. This situation is due in no small measure to the prehistoric context in which warfare evolved, a time before writing. In this lecture, we enter the historical era, when written records first become available for study. Certainty is not ensured, but a greater degree of clarity certainly prevails. The first cities appeared in Sumer in southern Iraq around 5,000 years ago. They were independent city-states, each with its own rulers, gods, laws, and administrative systems. These places provide us with our first written sources, but they also generated a fertile geopolitical context for wars. Cities housed people in concentrations not seen before. It is hard to arrive at firm figures, but the population of the typical Sumerian city-state certainly numbered in the tens of thousands. Such a pool of people offered rich pickings for the recruiter. The cities specialized labor so that not everyone had to farm to survive. Certain craftsmen could therefore dedicate their time to making and improving military technologies. Also, cities fostered political and social hierarchies that would seek to create armies in the first place and, once mustered, provide an officer corps to command them. Finally, cities governed agricultural regions, shared boundaries with neighbours, and stored surpluses, all of which makes for good reasons for going to war. In southern Iraq in particular, quarrels over irrigation rights and access to water sources are going to occur all but inevitably. It has to be admitted that the direct evidence for warfare among the earliest Sumerian city-states in the first part of the era dubbed the early dynastic period, that is roughly 3000 to 2600 BC, is virtually non-existent. For these very early centuries, there is very little written evidence. Yet the general considerations just reviewed, and the likelihood that warfare was already fairly common in the Neolithic era, make it unlikely that this early period in Sumer was warless, as some scholars would like us to believe. It is noteworthy that, in general, resort to force is a common feature of other city-state political cultures, such as classical Greece or the Maya of Central America. More suggestive is that when clear evidence for warfare does emerge in Sumer after about 2500 BC, weapons and military systems are already well advanced. This points to a prior period of evolution through trial and error. Unambiguous evidence for warfare appears in the period called Early Dynastic III, roughly 2600 to 2350 BC. Four classes of evidence combine to attest warfare in this era. First, actual weapons have been found in the royal burials of Ur, dating to around 2500 BC and onwards. Here, daggers, spears, maces, axes, and even chariots have been discovered. Chariots are seen to be well developed. They had 2 or 4 wheels, but they were drawn by asses, since domesticated horses were as yet unknown in the region. As we shall see, iconographic evidence is clear that at least some of these chariots were used in warfare, because chariots could also be used, of course, for racing or for hunting. Centuries later, the Greek historian Herodotus reports that Indian chariots in the service of the Persians were pulled by wild asses, so this appears to have remained a tradition in Eurasia long after Sumer had passed into history. Bows, when they are found, are of the straight arc type. The more complex composite bow appears only during the Akkadian Empire of 2350 to about 2100 BC, and we will consider that weapon towards the end of this lecture. Aside from weapons, there is iconographic evidence in the form of figures, reliefs, or inlays. A relief fragment from Girsu in Iraq, for instance, dated to about 2600, shows a bound victim being hit on the head with a mace. The mace is a peculiarly military weapon as it serves no other useful purpose. And the Girsu scene evokes the near-contemporary Egyptian depictions of Pharaoh clubbing prisoners of war to death with his mace, such as that on the Narmer palette, which we will review in the next lecture. The bound victim in the Girsu relief is probably a prisoner of war as well, although we can't be sure, to be honest. For the same place and period comes an oversized ceremonial lance head engraved with the inscription Lugal, King of Kish. Now, Lugal means king or headman, and King of Kish is an obscure Sumerian title that appears in early Mesopotamia in connection with military leaders. And let's not forget it is here carved onto a ceremonial lance head, a facsimile of a weapon of war. Both of these Girsu artifacts therefore suggest that warfare was not unknown only a few centuries after the first cities had appeared. One of the most remarkable objects from the royal burials at Ur, however, is the so-called Royal Standard, dating to about 2500 BC, and now in the British Museum in London. It depicts chariotry and infantry, battle, the taking of prisoners, and their presentation to a leader and his subordinate officers. Several features of these images stand out. The infantry are all depicted wearing uniform equipment, woolen skirts, hats or helmets with chin straps, and what appears to be an early form of armour in the form of studded cloaks. They also carry spears and socket axes of a type actually found in the royal burials. A socket axe, by the way, is a specifically military kind of axe. They fit over the shaft on their sockets and have a narrow penetrating blade. They're not much used for cutting down trees, but they're very good for penetrating people. The exact correspondence between representation and known artifact gives confidence that these pictures strive for a realistic presentation of the military hardware then available. Even more remarkable are the chariots, or more properly, war carts. We shall discuss their possible uses shortly, but for the moment, we note their uniformity of design and construction. Inlay figures from the site of Mari in Syria, dating to about 2500 to 2400 BC, also show uniformly equipped warriors. One figure wears a helmet, a war cloak, carries a socket axe, and looks almost identical to the troops depicted on the Standard of Ur, a city over 300 miles away. The Mari warrior also carries a sickle sword, one of the earliest representations of a sword on record. Sickle swords were akin to sabres, and they were designed for slashing and cutting rather than for stabbing. They were a popular weapon in the Near East and Egypt for more than 1500 years.
Are you ready to serve?
Also from Mari comes an inlaid scene of a victory procession where bound prisoners of war are paraded before standards and uniformly equipped soldiers wielding axes and spears. A war cart is depicted as well, and it is highly reminiscent of that shown on the Standard of Ur, again 300 miles away. What is really important in all of the foregoing is the congruence of equipment and weaponry, which show a striking uniformity even across regional borders. The third class of evidence for warfare in this period are military monuments such as city walls. We shall postpone consideration of these until a review of siege warfare in Lecture 8. The fourth and most crucial class of data is the written evidence. In the Sumerian king lists or the Epic of Gilgamesh and Akka, fighting between cities appears as a wholly unremarkable event. For instance, the king lists, compiled around 2000 BC, state that rulers competed intensely for the title High King, or Nam Lugal, which moved from ruler to ruler. The High King is only declared after the current holder has been smitten with weapons, as in Uruk was smitten with weapons and its kingship was carried to Ur. The language is very laconic, and the prospect of retrojection of later conditions onto these very early periods cannot be wholly ruled out. In the Epic of Gilgamesh and Akka, Akka besieges King Gilgamesh in his city of Uruk. Hostilities end after a parley, and a treaty is arranged. Clearly, these sources assume warfare as a natural part of the geopolitics of early Sumer. Administrative texts distinguish among different types of leader, some of them sacred, called the Sangha or the En, others apparently military, such as Lugal or Ensi. The categories appear to be fluid, so that a precise demarcation of duties is unrecoverable, if it ever existed at all. In addition, there are references to wars conducted against neighbouring peoples, like the Elamites of southwestern Iran, as well as campaigns by single rulers against multiple targets. Eannatum, the first king of the city-state of Lagash, for instance, is hailed as, quote, Eannatum, ruler of Lagash, who subjugates the foreign lands, or who destroys the foreign lands. The text goes on to list Eannatum's wars against nearly a dozen places across Iraq, Iran, and Syria. We also read references to the slaughtering of enemies and the heaping up of their bodies and skeletons in burial mounds on the battlefield. Boundary stones both depict and record in writing disputes between neighbouring city-states, and we shall examine one of these boundary stones in detail in just a moment. Nothing in any of these sources intimates that warfare among the Sumerian city-states was considered egregious, uncivilized, or unusual. In one remarkable case, the circumstances generating early wars can be discerned with particular clarity. This is the boundary dispute between the city-states of Umma and Lagash in what is today south-central Iraq. The dispute is traceable from a variety of inscribed objects found at Girsu, one of the three cities that comprised the polity called Lagash. The city of Umma lay north of Lagash, and between them was a borderland called the Gu'edin, which means the edge of the plain. It is important to appreciate, before we delve into the sordid details, that we only have the Lagashite side of the story. The Ummahite perspective is entirely lost to us. We cannot therefore take what we read at face value as a full and accurate record of what actually happened. It is clearly a biased account in which the Ummahites are consistently drawn as greedy and faithless scoundrels. That said, we can discern the course of the conflict for generations, from about 2600 BC down to 2300 BC and even beyond. But only its earliest phases need interest us here. It seems that at some early time, a chap called Meselim, who bore that elusive title King of Kish, established a negotiated boundary between Lagash and Umma along the Gu'edin, which was a strip of borderland about 40 miles long and a few miles wide. This was generally thought to have happened around 2600 BC. However, according to the Lagashites, the people of Umma later reneged on the deal, smashed the boundary markers, and occupied the disputed land. The people of Lagash, under their energetic king Eonatum, marched out and fought 2 battles with the Ummahites, winning both. Heaps of enemy corpses were piled up and buried, and a new boundary marker established. The Ummahite king was forced to swear humiliating oaths to stick to his agreements. It just so happens that this boundary marker has survived in 7 fragments. This is the so-called vulture stela, today in the Louvre in Paris, perhaps the most remarkable artifact to survive from early dynastic Sumer. It features a combination of inscribed texts and relief carvings and dates to about 2450 BC. The texts trace the course of this border dispute up to the point that the texts were carved, and of course they do so from the Lagashite perspective. They relate the contents of a dream promising victory sent to Eonatum of Lagash by Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash. Then they record the battles and their aftermath, and much space is devoted to the humiliating oaths forced on the defeated Ummahite king. It seems that a land lease agreement was reached, requiring Umma to pay rent to Lagash to use a portion of the debatable land in the Gu'edin. The reliefs show, on one side, Ningirsu ensnaring the Ummahites in his divine war net. On the other, we see the dream promising Eonatum victory. Eonatum is then depicted in his war cart, leading ordered ranks of socket axe and spear-wielding infantry out to battle. Later, on foot and carrying what seems to be a sickle sword, he leads a tight formation of infantry with huge shields and bristling spears as they trample the corpses of the Ummahite villains. A burial mound is stacked with corpses, and overhead, vultures soar, carrying away the heads of the enemy in their beaks. It is this image of the vultures carrying the heads away that gives the monument its modern name of the vulture stela. But the dispute did not end with Eonatum. Indeed, it became increasingly acrimonious and then escalated. In the generation after Eonatum, we are told that Umma defaulted on its payments and arrogantly used canals intended as boundary markers to irrigate its own fields. Envoys were sent and rebuffed. Again there was a battle, and again Umma was defeated. This time, the Ummahite leader was killed by his own people for his military failure, the ultimate vote of no confidence. In later generations, we read of other city-states getting involved in the dispute, notably Uruk and Ur, both states that lay south of Lagash. The war was no longer confined to the borderland between Umma and Lagash and seems to have been carried up to the very walls of Umma itself. Eventually, however, a king of Umma called Lugal-Zaghazi rose up and conquered much of southern Iraq, forming a sort of proto-empire in the region. His dominance did not last long, however, for a more threatening power was looming to the north. Now, several features of this series of events between Umma and Lagash are noteworthy. Between them, these texts record the earliest battles of recorded history. They do so, however, in very general terms that offer no details about the army's tactical movements or the course of the fighting. Of the battles themselves, we get only very laconic notices such as, "he fought with him." Now that's not a lot to go on. The emphasis, rather, is on the slaughter, heaping up, and burial of the defeated enemy. We get tantalizing notices of rulers recruiting from foreign lands, but it is unclear whether this means from other Sumerian city-states or from outside Sumer altogether. Whatever the case, such notices suggest an advanced level of military commerce and careful planning. Before setting out on campaign, Sumerian rulers sought to maximize their military resources. Now, putting this meagre body of written evidence, the flat nature of Mesopotamian terrain, and the depictions on the vulture stela and the Royal Standard of Ur, putting that all together, we must envisage Sumerian battles as fought in the open field between armies of infantry deployed in tight ranks and armed with shields, spears, socket axes, and possibly sickle swords. There were also archers, since Eannatum was hit with an arrow during his second battle with the Umayyads and incapacitated. That's mentioned in the vulture stele in the text. The war carts also played some role in the fighting, which we will consider more closely in just a minute. Phrases in the written records leave no doubt that Sumerian armies fought in the open field. So we read, for instance, in the border dispute texts, and I quote, "He recruited foreigners and transgressed the boundary channel of Ningirsu. The ruler of Lagash fought with him in the Ugiga field, the field of Ningirsu." We should note briefly that it was the habit of Sumerians to give names to tracts of land, here termed, for instance, Ugiga, and then refer to those tracts by those names. And in this instance, the battle is expressly stated to have taken place in an open field, in this instance, the Ugiga field. It is noteworthy that the Umma-Lagash conflict is generational and indecisive in nature. In this respect, the dispute looks more like primitive war than real or true war. But true war it most certainly was, by any definition. This was organized violence conducted by centralized states at a sophisticated level. The casus belli were a mixture of tangible concerns for borderlands and water rights, and the restoration of honor besmirched by past wrongs and defeats. The battles were intended to decide a particular dispute, and despite their ultimate failure to do so on the strategic level, they can be classed as decisive engagements in the tactical sense. The language of the surviving accounts is religious, where gods are credited with direct ownership of the disputed lands. We just saw the field of Ningirsu, for instance, and also of their products. The gods also help prosecute the battles. They send dreams of victory or otherwise inspire the commanders. Now, this language may reflect a real Mesopotamian conception of warfare as a genuinely religious activity, or it may be due to the sacred nature of the record's context. They're usually located in temples or shrines. Whatever the case, warfare seems to be folded into the religious life of these early Sumerian city-states. In sum, then, the wars of the early dynastic Sumerian city-states appear to have been sophisticated affairs in which centrally recruited and uniformly equipped armies contested in pitched battles to decide disputes between their polities. Against this background, a recently suggested model for Sumerian warfare proves to be untenable. Doyne Dawson, in his 2001 book, The First Armies, suggests that Sumerian armies, such as they were really mobs of peasant levies, poorly trained and even more poorly organized and deployed. The military operations of such a rabble would not likely be too impressive, and so Sumerian warfare was not marked by complex field operations involving infantry and chariotry. Rather, warfare in this period was dominated by sieges. Since defenses far outstripped the capabilities of the would-be attackers, these sieges were largely ineffectual. A sort of Cold War stalemate prevailed, and the boastful assertions of the royal inscriptions are the unique images, like those in the vulture stela, are not good guides to Sumerian military realities, at least goes Doyne Dawson's argument. It seems to me that this model flies in the face of a fair assessment of the surviving evidence. It may be true that objects like the Standard of Ur or the vulture stela are unique, but they have survived by chance, and their close agreement on matters of military equipment is therefore all the more remarkable for that fact. Their value as evidence is, if anything, enhanced rather than diminished by their uniqueness. It would require very special pleading indeed to insist that, by a bizarre coincidence, the two most informative surviving iconographic representations of Sumerian warfare that we have both happen to be seriously misleading. When combined with the evidence from Mari, the opposite, in fact, seems to be the case. As to battle mechanics, the vulture stela plainly depicts tight formation of infantry in action. The accompanying text and scenes of burial mounds set this image in the context of a battle in the open field. Indeed, there is no mention or also depiction of sieges in this or any of the Lagashite records about its dispute with Umma. This situation stands in sharp contrast with contemporary Egypt where, as we shall see in the next lecture, sieges are the commonest type of engagement recorded in Old Kingdom depictions. I am not suggesting that sieges did not take place in early Sumer, but rather that the contention that they were the only significant form of military engagement is not supported by the evidence. As we have noted, the infantry in the Vulture Stela, as well as the troops depicted on the Mari inlays and on the Royal Standard of Ur, all have notably standardized equipment. This observation alone suggests a considerable degree of organization and central control over warfare in general and over the manufacture of military hardware in particular. This is entirely consistent with other aspects of administration in these early city-states, which was heavily centralized and geared toward the collection, cataloguing and redistribution of goods. A further inference may be made. The use of shock weapons such as socket axes and spears and the wearing of helmets and protective clothing are surely signs that these troops expected to participate in close hand-to-hand combat. On the Standard of Ur, the infantry are in an ordered line. On the Vulture Stela, they march in serried ranks and fight in close formation. This is no rabble of conscripted peasants who fight as a formationless mob, showing off and firing arrows at each other from a distance on some sort of primitive model. This is serious, organized warfare. The war carts of this era are, to be sure, problematic. The clearest depictions of them are on the Standard of Ur, but their design is also recognizable on the Vulture Stela and on the Mari inlays. They are four-wheeled vehicles, pulled by asses, steered with, of all things, nose rings. The cabins, apparently made of hide stretched over a wooden frame, have a raised front fitted with a quiver for spears. There are two crew members, a driver and a weapon wielder. The latter is invariably armed with an axe or a spear. Now, just how these contraptions were actually used in battle is not at all apparent. Some, like Dawson, think that they would have been utterly useless. How could you control four asses by means of reins strung through their noses? The cumbersome design looks neither stable nor maneuverable. This argument derives primarily from comparison with the later, better attested use of chariots as mobile firing platforms for archers or for javelineers. But just because the Sumerians lacked the true chariot on the later model does not mean that their efforts were wholly futile. If the war carts were not used in warfare, then why are they shown in that context? Dismissing them as useless doesn't get us very far. That said, the tactical function of the war carts remains problematic. They were not mobile firing platforms, since they don't have archers or javelineers in them. So perhaps they were used only to transport prestigious warriors, who then dismounted to fight on foot. The Vulture Stela, for instance, shows Eannatum in his war cart at the head of his marching troops, but leading his ranked infantry into battle on foot. Other scholars see a very different function for these carts. The raised front of the cabin, the use of axes or spears by the warrior crew member, as well as the protective covering discernible on the asses' chests, suggest to some that the carts were expected to plough into enemy ranks as shock weapons. Certainly the carts on the Standards of Ur are pulled by running asses. Their legs become more and more animated from right to left. They're clearly galloping, if you like. They also careen over prostrate corpses, and in one case, a crew member leans out to spear a fallen foe. In one near contemporary text from the Umma-Lagash dispute, we read of 60 teams of asses and crews were abandoned on a field of battle. All of this certainly suggests some sort of active use in battle beyond mere transport. But what was it? If I may be so bold, I would like to suggest here a possibility that I have not seen aired elsewhere. This is that the carts were employed in mopping up operations to run down the defeated enemy. This would explain their prominence on the battlefield, the galloping asses, the use of weapons like axe and spear, and the trampled enemy shown on the Standard of Ur. Indeed, I note with interest that the only standing enemy depicted on the Standard, in connection with the war carts, has his back to the vehicle as if in flight. Such a function would not require a great degree of maneuverability on the part of the drivers, who just had to point the cart in the right direction and go to it. Regardless of this detail, what all the available evidence tells us is that early Sumerian warfare was not restricted to ineffectual siege engagements. It was an organized, centralized and planned activity of the state, folded into the ideology of leadership and religion, and conducted with a high degree of sophistication in open field battles between ranked infantry, missile troops, and war carts. Sieges there undoubtedly were, but if so, they appear less obtrusively in the record. We saw before how Umma appears to have prevailed in its border dispute with Lagash when Lugal-Zagizi of Umma conquered the traditional realm of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia. But he was not to prevail for long, since from the north exploded the conqueror Sargon of Akkad, who established the first empire in history over all of Mesopotamia, that is, over Sumer, Babylonia in central Mesopotamia, and the northern reaches of the two rivers. This happened around 2350 BC, and the Akkadian Empire lasted for a little over 2 centuries. The city of Akkad, or Agade, has not actually been located. Some believe that it lies under modern Baghdad, so we can't expect it to be excavated anytime soon. But it was certainly located in central Mesopotamia in the region generally called Babylonia. Sargon's life became the stuff of legend, and since his biography survives mostly from later romanticized accounts, the historical details often prove elusive. But it is clear that he was a genuine historical figure of great importance. He was the first to unify all of Mesopotamia under a single, centralized polity, and he did so by military means. In fact, we can go further. Sargon's conquest and the continuation of his family's rule over a centralized state by dynastic means established the essential pattern for Near Eastern imperialists for millennia to come. In later centuries, the Third Dynasty of Ur, the Old Babylonians under Hammurabi, the Middle and Neo-Assyrians, and the Persians, and countless others in this region followed Sargon's prototype, with variations, of course. For this reason, the Akkadian Empire is a pivotal moment in Mesopotamian history. From the written and iconographic sources, it seems clear that the Akkadians were heavily militarized. Sargon was remembered above all as a great conqueror, and his successors likewise. His grandson, Naram-Sin, for instance, who ruled around 2250 BC, left a great victory stela, which is now in the Louvre, which depicts him leading an army up a mountain to crush enemies. Naram-Sin himself is considerably bigger than his soldiers and wears a horned helmet, reflecting the divine status credited to him in some of his inscriptions. He also carries a battle axe and a composite bow, one of the first appearances of this weapon on record. The composite bow represents a major advance in military technology. It was made of several materials glued together: wood, bone, tendon, and sinew. This gave the bow such great tension that when unstrung, it bowed forward, and to be strung, it had to be bent all the way back again. Later Assyrian reliefs show it taking 2 men to string such a bow. Further, the bow's extreme tension meant that it could be relatively small, about a meter or so long, while still packing serious penetrative power over a range of between 500 and 600 feet, outstripping simple bows by 150 feet or more. Some have suggested, in fact, that the Akkadians developed this weapon and conquered Mesopotamia with it, while others prefer to think of an Akkadian mastery of siegecraft as the key to their military success. Whatever the case, they certainly prosecuted wars more efficiently than their contemporaries, and this allowed them to conquer Mesopotamia. Akkadian reliefs regularly show warriors, combat, and plenty of prisoners of war, who suggest that Akkad was militarized in a way that other states up to that point had not been. Their imperial ideology, recoverable from several sources, places a premium on the military qualities of their leaders. In inscriptions, the rulers are hailed as conquering cities, carrying Akkadian arms into regions outside Mesopotamia and subduing the rebellious at home. One text praises Naram-Sin for winning 9 battles in 1 year. But we cannot take on faith claims that all the regions attacked were permanently conquered. The fact that a series of Akkadian kings had to return to the same places suggests punitive raids rather than permanent extra-Mesopotamian conquests were the order of the day. Naram-Sin may have declared himself king of the 4 corners of the universe, but that did not make it so. The organization of the Akkadian army remains very unclear, but we must imagine it drawing heavily on subject peoples. Access to a deeper pool of manpower is a perennial advantage of empire. Sargon himself seems to have had a royal corps of 5,400 men who are described as eating daily in his presence, quote unquote, and so were maintained at state expense. This suggests a royal standing army, but its full extent and composition remain very obscure to us. The Akkadian Empire exacted tribute from conquered cities and imposed a standard system of weights and measures and laws all across the realm. Local rulers were contracted into Akkadian service, and all official correspondence used the Akkadian language, local languages being used for local affairs. Imperial ideology was promulgated through inscriptions and monuments set up in the cities of the empire, such as the Victory Stela of Naram Sin. Eventually, the Akkadian Empire collapsed around 2100 BC under pressure both from within and from without. But its legacy was towering. It had shown what could be achieved by military conquest. Sargon's empire now stood as a precedent for later generations to follow. Many kingdoms and polities tried to emulate it, but none more successfully than the Assyrian Empire of the first millennium BC. Before looking at the Assyrians, however, we must detour to Egypt and consider military developments along the banks of the Nile.